I will use the mic instead of shouting. My name's Steve Kimball. I'm a researcher at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I too have done quite a bit of work in the area of principal evaluation and compensation. I've also started my research career in the area of teacher evaluation, looking at standards-based evaluation, focusing on Danielson framework in particular. But I've been involved in the CPRE Teacher Compensation Project at UW-Madison, and more recently with the Value Added Research Center, and a project with Matt right now that's called the Comprehensive Assessment for Leadership for Learning, which we'll talk just a little bit about in this presentation. So glad to be here. Do you want the mic?
Yes. Good morning. My name is Alyssa Ford-Heywood. I currently manage the Pittsburgh Public Schools Principals Incentive Program. And one of the things that I've been involved in throughout the last 3 years is coordinating the district systems to support the implementation of this project, for which I'll speak more about in my presentation today.
Okay. There we go. Okay. Thank you. Anyway, that's kind of another long answer to that question. There's no perfect answer to that yet. And I kind of reiterate what Matt would say on that. We have to see how this pans out. I'm going to skip forward and then come back to that slide, because I think building on the scorecard, it's important to think of how do we do this? What's the process look like if we're going to use a scorecard type approach? And we would recommend a performance management type strategy. And again, this is something that's used often in the private sector, and it's been taken over into school leadership as well, in addition to teacher evaluation and support. The idea here is the last scorecard I showed you had a whole bunch of different dimensions of leadership and measures of those leadership dimensions. But really it takes a supervisor or assistant superintendent and a principal to sit down and identify what are the key things I'm going to focus on this year. And many of you, if you've been principals, have done this with your teachers as well. Here's what we need to work on. Here's a key district or school improvement priority. Here's how you can affect that priority, and I'm going to be looking for evidence of that. So the principal and the superintendent or assistant superintendent need to agree to the goals at the beginning of the year and what's going to be worked on. And it can't be everything under the sun. You need to set some priorities here. Those are agreed upon. You agree upon evidence sources then, both qualitative and quantitative. You want to see, you want to see the achievement bar moving or whatever the outcomes are you're measuring. But you also want to see evidence of practice that demonstrates how the principal has performed in the practice sense. And then throughout the year, there needs to be some formative feedback. Principals sometimes get very little feedback other than, are people complaining or not? And that's basically what the district hears, right? When does a principal get evaluated? Well, when someone complains, either a board member or a parent or a teacher. So if they can get formative feedback throughout the year on how they're doing, it's going to set them up to have a more agreement on the outcome. There'll be more fairness, but it'll also give them an opportunity to change as the year progresses. And then finally, that it ends with some consequences. It could be, more than the pat in the back. You might have a performance award based on the results, or there may be some remediation needed, or your performance evaluation overall could lead to different promotion decisions as well. So that's kind of the long and the short of that, and I will go back now since we skipped around a little bit. That brings some coherence around a principal performance strategy using a performance management approach. Well, this brings some coherence, we think, to an overall system for principals across the district. And this same schematic can be used for states as well when you think about it. The issue here is these should be connected pieces. Sabrina Lane mentioned this issue of alignment. This is kind of a visual way of thinking about alignment too. The idea is I would insert performance competencies in here, because the performance competencies ought to drive what principals are trained upon, and these performance competencies ought to be linked to what's important for your school or district. But it also ought to be used to assess potential candidates for principal roles, how they're hired and developed, with induction strategies, and the compensation and incentive piece as well. And obviously working conditions fits in the mix for all of those. And when we say performance assessment, it's highlighted here. It's not just one single thing. There's a performance assessment relevant to all of these human resource functions. And with that, I will turn it over to Alyssa, who will talk about the Pittsburgh experience, which touches on a number of these pieces as well.
Thank you.
And she has a mic attached to her, so she didn't need a
mic.
conference call.
So I think one of the points I wanted to highlight about
Steve's presentation was the point he made about reasons why districts consider this work. So before I launched into the specifics of our Principal Pay for Performance program, I wanted to give you some background about why Pittsburgh chose to engage in this work. So it was in 2007 when our district had just hired a new superintendent, and one of the charges that the board gave our superintendent was to develop some strategies for closing our existing racial achievement gap and improving achievement overall for our district. And we believed that some of that work needed to begin with our principals by holding them to new expectations and levels of accountability. So we began developing our theory of action, which gets back to one of the slides that Matt presented, which was believing that principals as instructional leaders were in the best position to be able to implement or enforce teachers to change their practices in their buildings, and that would result in a new culture within their buildings that would support improved student achievement outcomes. But part of that theory of action depended on principals being effective. And when we looked at our school district, we realized that we had principals in positions that may not have been entirely effective. So we couldn't expect that we would just cast principals into these roles and without providing them with levels of support. And we believed that that support had to impact our complete hiring and employment decisions. So we knew that all of our systems would need to all our systems from recruitment to compensation would need to be revised in order to support this new initiative for principals and thus impact our theory of action on how principals would lead the work in their schools. So from that theory of action was birthed our PULSE initiative, our Pittsburgh's Urban Leadership System for Excellence. And we believe that work should focus on two primary strands, and that's the systems of accountability and support. In reference to our support, we begin that with our Pella program, which was our Pittsburgh Emerging Leaders Academy. And that essentially looked at how we recruited principals for our schools. We brought them in for a one-year kind of internship where they learned how to become an effective principal. We put them under the tutelage of other principals in our district who we believe were strong principals, and we also provided them with rich and comprehensive professional development for 1 year before they actually even entered our buildings as principals. Another component is we also wanted to ensure that our existing novice and experienced principals had access to rich and deep professional development. And you'll see that demonstrated in the wheel as our Administration Induction and Leadership Academy. In reference to the accountability, we wanted to make sure that the folks who were responsible for supervising our principal leaders also had training and professional development that would assist them in being able to recognize good quality leadership practices in school buildings. And the final two pieces, which I'll be highlighting in my presentation, was we wanted to make sure that our existing evaluation and compensation systems were effectively tied together and also linked to student achievement outcomes. In reference to our evaluation tool, which is being passed out to you now, we wanted to make sure that it reinforced and cultivated practices that we wanted to see amongst our leaders in our school buildings. What we used to identify a rubric is we brought in a consultant who was able to provide us with several examples of a rubric. We looked at the ISLIC standards as a foundation. We also looked at Marzano's work and the Halverson rubric to assist us in developing a rubric which we believe was specific to the needs of Pittsburgh. For the rubric, which you have here, principals and assistant principals engage in a practice of evidence collection where they're using the different components of the rubric, which is divided into 5 standards and 27 separate components. Principals and assistant principals are collecting evidence to support each standard and then looking at where it fits in amongst the components, and then having a range of ratings from rudimentary to accomplished for which they can score that piece of evidence. Any questions about the rubric as you all look through that? I'll give you a couple minutes to look through it. Yes.
As others are looking through, just a general question. Our state is going in and putting together a set of standards and an evaluation framework, and then we'll even have some instruments and tools coming out in a few years to share with us. One of my questions is as we look at the development of evaluation systems and we look at the development of evaluation tools, is there any research to encourage or show a non-binding whatever in the relationship between collaboration of principals and others, or teachers if it was teacher? Is there any relationship between their collaboration and the creation of the assessment, the evaluation tool, as compared to the implementation of the perceived effectiveness of the tools?
I can't speak to the research, but I could just speak to the practice at Pittsburgh. We did engage principals in the process of developing the tool and the whole performance and evaluation plan. And I think of the tools that we've utilized, the rubric has become the more accepted tool than the value-added measures that we use. So in essence, principals have more faith in this rubric because I believe because they were a part of it and because they know how they can impact it through the data collection process.
So I would say the answer to your question is no at this point in terms of our research. We do not have any kind of research evidence that suggests that a collaborative process, if I understand your question correctly, a collaborative process in the development of a principal performance assessment system is better than a non-collaborative process. I know that different states are taking different approaches and engaging different constituencies in the development of these processes, but at this point there is no research evidence. However, I would say that if you're not engaging your constituents in designing the system, you will likely have problems down the road for a couple of reasons. One is that a formative and summative assessment system are linked, and that it is important that all principals know and understand the standards that they're being evaluated against, and that is potentially a legal issue. And it's also a validity issue. So you want to make sure of that, absolutely. This may be slipping my mind now. The second thing, I think, is going back to the status of the research. At this point, our field is not at a place where we're saying certain weights and measures are important to have and are motivating to people. So I think by engaging various constituents in the process, you're ensuring that you're representing their values in the design of the system, which is incredibly important at this time. And then, researchers and evaluators can come in with their white coats. I left mine at home today, and then make gather some evidence about the qualities of the system, the satisfaction of the system, and then the achievement resulting.
I echo that, and I'd just add one thing. You pointed out the counterfactual, and I think one of the reasons that merit pay plans failed in the past is because they were done to teachers. There was not the involvement and the engagement, and therefore the lack of the buy-in as well as understanding. So for all those reasons, the understanding, the buy-in, perceptions of fairness, I think it's pretty critical, and most people would say you better involve the people you're going to evaluate in the design of the process, or at the very least in the training of how it's going to be used.
And I just wanted to add another point about Pittsburgh is that we did include principals from the onset of our thinking about implementing this. We engaged them through a design committee as well as through a steering committee that would drive the work of this initiative even before we implemented it. Yes.
I was looking at your professional rating form. I noticed that there were two regarding performance level. It's either satisfactory or unsatisfactory. But then when you look at the standards, there are actually four.
Yes.
And how is, so the final, once the final summative information is given to the principal, how is, you have the two levels, how is that associated with, let's say, for example, incentives and that sort of thing?
Well, the two levels came as
I'm sorry. Okay,
the, I think what she's asking is how we move from a system where we are evaluating various components on 4 levels to a final rating of satisfactory and unsatisfactory. And I want to say that the satisfactory and unsatisfactory is primarily driven by our state's laws for how we evaluate people. But we were permitted to utilize the comprehensive rubric to be able to provide more comprehensive information to our principals. And we use basically a preponderance of the evidence to determine whether or not someone will be rated satisfactory or unsatisfactory. And the way that that translates into compensation is, of course, if you're rated unsatisfactory, then you're not eligible for any of the compensation dollars. We do have a, and I'll talk a little bit about how that fleshes out in the presentation. Okay. Okay.
Did you want to talk about it?
Yeah. Okay. So when we implemented this program, some of the things that we realized is that this would impact our entire system, and we would have to reconfigure some of the ways in which we had done things. Specifically, prior to the implementation of this system, principals were evaluated probably once a year at the end of the year, and oftentimes did not receive a lot of feedback about the things that they were doing well or the things that they required additional support with. So this process has allowed us to engage in a process where we're able to do several observations throughout the year in principals' building, and after those observations, we're also able to provide them with some feedback about the practices that are observed. In addition to that, principals also participate in a mid-year self-evaluation, which allows them to evaluate their own evidence and look at how it would fit into the rubric, and then have a conversation with their assistant superintendents about how they also see their practice. In areas where the two disagree, it provides a forum for ongoing discussion about why those disagreements occur and how, what types of support can be provided to improve their practice throughout the rest of the year. Additionally, we were able to provide some different thresholds for our novice principals. We knew that a principal coming in would could be at a disadvantage to achieve the highest level of proficiency. So we wanted to provide them with opportunities to get supports and to build their practice from their novice year until they became experienced principals. And one other thing we were able to do is, again, provide several opportunities to evaluate the various components and show principals those areas where they were doing well versus those areas where they needed additional supports. Okay. Prior to the implementation of this, our assistant superintendents wore many hats, but one of the things we wanted to do as a district was show that this was important to us, and we believe that we could do that by putting more emphasis on the time that the assistant superintendents spent in schools. We also recognize the comprehensiveness of this venture, and that the only way that assistant superintendents were going to be able to collect the evidence and conduct the observations was by spending at least 60% of their week in school. So now assistant superintendents are in schools at least 3 days out of the week. I'd say most have an average of 20 schools, so they're in schools, that particular school, at least once a month, more often for those schools requiring additional supports.
Alyssa?
Yes. Sorry.
Do principals have like mentors?
Do new principals have mentors? The question was,
Does new principals have mentors?
Newly hired principals, our PELAs, have mentors. We are currently engaged in a process of, for our first and second year principals, of aligning them to mentors. But no, not formally for our first and second year principals, but for newly hired PELA principals, soon to be principals, they are assigned a mentor. Okay. In specific reference to our achievement bonus, we wanted to implement a system that would assist us not just in rewarding principals, but being able to distinguish between our high-performing principals and our ineffective principals. So we were able to, through our rubric, able to implement a system that provided a performance increment to our to those who were able to demonstrate meeting proficiency on the rubric. In addition to that, we were also able to implement an achievement bonus based on student achievement outcomes. And how the two flesh out is that the achievement bonus is awarded to principals as a one-time lump sum payment that does not become a part of their salaries and allows principals to earn an amount up to $10,000 based on student achievement outcomes. There was a question about, how do you decide how to weight the amounts? And I think Pittsburgh decided, because we were a school improvement district, that achievement had to be a primary focus for us, and thus we weighted a significant portion of the compensation on student achievement. But we also didn't want to neglect principal practices. So as a result of the rubric, principals can earn a maximum of $2,000, which becomes a part of their permanent salary for a total compensation related to this initiative of $12,000. The Pittsburgh Public Schools, and the question was, where does the money come from? In 2007, as we were thinking about this initiative, it happened to be at a time when the federal Department of Education was also rolling out TIF funding, Teachers Incentive Fund funding, and the district was able to secure 5 years of funding to fund this initiative, but had made a commitment, even despite the challenges occurring with the state budget, that we would find the money within our own budgets once this grant runs out to support this initiative. I'm sorry, yes.
I'm sorry. I'm a little bit confused with the, could you just go back to the bonus structure? For the first part, the achievement bonus, you can give a principal $10,000
up to
one time.
One time.
Okay.
Correct.
Then the second one is a performance increment. So it's like $2,000 per year. And that goes up to, is there a maximum for that amount?
No, the maximum is $2,000, but that $2,000 becomes a part of the permanent salary. So that principal has an opportunity to earn an additional $2,000 every year.
Every year.
That becomes a part of the salary.
Okay, and then at the bottom where you have max eligible payout, $12,000.
Well, that's the two amounts combined. So each year they have an opportunity to earn both the $10,000 achievement bonus and the performance increment, which the two together total $12,000.
Okay, thank you so much.
And Alyssa, just on the point out on the performance increment, that's based on the practice measures, and that replaced annual salary increases.
Yes.
So
Yes.
They moved away from an automatic single salary schedule to this. They had to demonstrate practice in order to earn it.
So we no longer have that step salary system. The only way that principals can incur salary increases is through participation in this program, which is not optional. Okay. For the measures that we use for the achievement bonus, we were able to engage principals in the process of identifying which measures to include as a part of this process, and that was done through our design committee work. Additionally, we were able to, the district had a strategic plan which was called Excellence for All, and there were some specific achievement goals identified in that plan that we were also able to incorporate into our achievement bonus measures. I can make it available to you, but we have a complex VAM for different school configurations that are based on these measures that we use to determine the percent of the bonus that principals would be eligible to receive. In order to receive the maximum achievement bonus amount, principals would need to be able to demonstrate that their schools had made at least 10% growth in both math and reading. Some of the things that we've seen as a result of implementing this program is that, as Steve mentioned, we no longer have this salary step system. All salary increases are as a result of this program. Additionally, we've utilized this system, particularly performance on the rubric, to determine whether or not principal placements will continue to occur. So no longer are principals guaranteed. I know with our past system, it was often difficult to move principals out of positions. There was a reluctancy, I think, to demote or give principals an unsatisfactory rating. Since we've implemented this program, we've now become very focused on whether or not principals are effective, and if they're not, we've moved to either demote principals into assistant principal positions. In cases, principals have been moved to choose retirement probably earlier than they would have wanted to. And in other cases, we've had principals resign prior to receiving the final performance rating. Well, we use that in decisions to place principals in some of our most challenging schools, because one of the things we also wanted to incent was to ensure that our most effective principals were in our highest need schools. So we use that information to also determine whether those principals would get placed into those schools. And we are using a determination of whether there's been a record of effectiveness in determining whether or not principals would be considered for other positions within the district.
Just a quick question. In your first year of implementation, how many principals qualified for the performance pay, and what did the student achievement increases look like?
In the first year, I would say probably about 85% qualified for some percent of the payout. In reference to student achievement, I would say in the second year is when we began to see more significant student achievement outcomes, and that was primarily in our K through 5 schools, not in the high schools, unfortunately. One of the things that we were able to achieve as a district last year is we were able to achieve AYP for our entire district, which was pretty monumental for an urban school district. So we were one of the, well, there's only 2 urban school districts in Pennsylvania, but we were the only urban school district in our state to achieve AYP in the second year of implementation.
Pennsylvania is a union state?
Correct.
And teachers have tenure?
Correct.
What kind of flexibility do principals have in transferring or moving teachers? Involuntary transfers, voluntary transfers? How do you manage that for the principals who may be high-achieving principals but don't have the flexibility to move staff?
Well, we've really focused on this human capital piece. So we don't want principals just to move teachers. If teachers are ineffective, we want principals to go through the process of rating those teachers out if they're not effective. So and there are rules within the collective bargaining agreement that allow us to be able to do that. We just have to document and collect the evidence of their poor practice to support the yes, to support the unsatisfactory rating. Yes. For teachers? It's funny you should say that. We began this process with our principals, but this year we're implementing a similar performance evaluation compensation plan for teachers. So we're trying to align the two so that they both support one another. And some of the things that we're looking at some of the things we have in place is a comprehensive evaluation and evidence collection process for teacher practices as well.
And Alyssa, the teachers union was involved with designing that.
Pardon me?
The teachers union was involved
Yes,
with designing
yes,
that approach as well.
Exactly.
So what I would just highlight here is what Pittsburgh's unique with. A lot of people focus on teachers first. Let's get the teachers, doggone it. Well, teachers have the biggest impact on student achievement. It makes sense. But they started with the principals and tried to get this performance management culture going with principals. And then, okay, I don't know if that was the big impact that brought teachers along, but they said, okay, they're not just picking on us. We're a part of the solution too, so we're participating. So.
And actually, when we began with principals, we had teachers who were looking at principals saying, well, here you're getting this incentive, but, we're doing the work, so why can't we be a part of that? So we had people who weren't included in the initial process at some point asking, well, why aren't we being considered, especially our most effective teachers were wondering why they weren't having an option to have the same incentives that principals were being exposed to.
I'd like to ask you, when you're talking about the impact of the ratings, on your chart here you have retirement. Mm-hmm. Do you actually push them to retirement? How do you do that?
I think we kind of gave them the come to Jesus talk where we're saying, this is where we are at this point in the year. You're at the point where you're going to be rated at unsatisfactory. You may want to make some decisions. I mean, you have an opportunity, because this would happen at the mid-year. You have an opportunity to improve your practice, and this is what you need to do to improve your practice by the end of the year to achieve a satisfactory rating. And some may have decided that they weren't able or willing to do that and made a decision at that point to retire. One of the other ways that we use the evaluation tool is to identify individuals' professional development needs. Again, as I mentioned, in the areas where there's some additional support needed, we attempt to identify that and align professional development to meet those needs. One of the things that I started out by saying is that we began this process in 2007, but I wanted to make it known that it's a work in progress. We've continued to refine this rubric. The rubric that you have now is not the rubric that we currently are using. One of the things that we realized is that when principals had to engage in the process of evidence collection for themselves, for their assistant principal, and now for their teachers, it was a bit overwhelming. So we stripped it down a little bit to focus on some core competencies that we wanted to cultivate within the district, and we've since focused those power components on the teaching and learning environment and on the human capital piece, because we're also encouraging principals to ensure that they have the best teachers in place, the best teachers in the right places with the right resources. So we wanted to show that priority in our rubric as well. And so now we believe that principals are more able to focus in on the things that we believe are most linked to student achievement. And then finally, we were able to implement a high-needs school plan, which, as I mentioned before, incents principals to go to the most effective principals to go to schools that have some of the highest needs. Okay, so again, just to reinforce that, we're hoping that the information that we are sharing today will be able to assist you in your development of similar programs, and we're also taking information back, that we would be able to use that to continue to improve our program moving forward.
Thanks, Alyssa. So we have a few minutes left. I would open it up for questions or comments in general.
Well, I would just invite Alyssa to keep going on the incentives for high-need schools. Obviously, all the schools represented here are schools that need great leaders and often have not received that level of leadership. So is that just compensation, or what other pieces are you putting into place to help get great leaders assigned to schools that need them the most?
Well, one of the things I mentioned is that our threshold for eligibility for the full achievement bonus was to meet 10% growth. And we didn't want to dissuade principals from going to those more challenging schools, because that could be a hurdle to demonstrate 10% growth and be able to, but not negating that, maybe 5% growth was pretty significant for those schools. So one of the things that we did is we reduced the threshold for level of growth for those schools so that principals wouldn't see that as a barrier to go to those schools.
Other questions? Okay. Yes.
What has been the general, over the years that you've been doing this now, how has the climate, morale, and culture amongst your district leadership changed in time? And has this had any impact yet on your ability to retain administrators, or are they looking to go to easier pastures to graze in?
I think the culture has actually gotten more receptive to this approach, because we are now pursuing it with our teachers, and I think principals are now able to see how once this emerged with the teachers, the importance of this. So I think we're finding that principals are more engaged, especially in the data collection, and they're more interested. They've bought into the belief that they can impact student achievement. So I think we found that, and no, we've not seen a decline. In fact, our Pella program, which has become the pipeline for principals to come into our district, continues to have a significant number of applicants each year. We have a rich application pool for our Pella program, so I think that's showing that people still want to be a part of the culture in Pittsburgh.
Good morning. One question. How do you deal with, when do you give the WKC, in Wisconsin it's the WKCE test, whatever your state assessment. And the reason I asked that question, at one point, I was at I've been at various schools. I was at a high-performance school for about 4 years. Then I was promoted into a middle school that was a low-performing school. I moved in one day before the school year started. We take the WKCE in November. So that particular year, the students did not do that well, even though I hadn't been there. Mm-hmm. That still went on my evaluation because I'm the principal at that point in time. How do you all account for that?
Well, our PSSAs are given in the spring, but the results are not available until the fall. But the principal who was in the school during the time when the assessment was given. And then all kids are not attributed to that principal. So we have cutoff periods for which kids get included into that calculation. Principals verify that that student was in their schools during that window. And then those students get attributed to that particular principal's value-added scores.
All right. If there's not anything else, we'll be up here to answer some questions for you. The revised information will be up on the National High School Center's website, and we look forward to talking to you in the future. Thank you very much.